Our last scale family, the Diaspidae, is the largest one with more than 2,000 species found worldwide. They are called armored scales because the males and females are covered with a waxy cover called a test. All of these scales have a mobile crawler, but once the crawler is settled down, it won't move from the site unless it's a male. The males pupate under a waxy test, then emerge as tiny gnat-like insects with only one pair of wings. The females remain under their test, which is simply enlarged to accommodate her larger body. Armored scales can be very difficult to manage, not only because they are protected from being contacted by pesticides, but they often enter into non-feeding periods when even systemic insecticides are not effective. Remember that armored scales are some of the most highly modified insects found in the Hemiptera. In this case, there has been a maximum reduction in the body plan. Most armored scale females have no obvious antennae, eyes, or legs. They simply look like plump blobs with a long set of stylets arising from the underside of the body. Armored scales appear as tiny, round, oval to elongate forms with a waxy shell. If you look closely, the shell, which is called the test, consists of three parts. The first exuvium, which is the crawler exoskeleton, the second exuvium, which is the second instar nymphal exoskeleton, and then the secretory cover, the true waxy cover. Most armored scales have to be inspected under a microscope for accurate species identification, but many species can be identified by their test shape and form and where the first and second exuvium is located. Remember that males of many species are distinctly different than the females in test shape and form. Because of the waxy cover, armored scales don't produce honeydew, and their small size limits their egg production. At this point, let's review some major differences between soft scales and armored scales. Soft scales are usually larger and don't make a hard, waxy shell that covers the body. The soft scale exoskeleton becomes leathery and domed up when the female produces eggs. Soft scales are usually copious honeydew producers as nymphs and developing females. Soft scales generally feed on plant vascular bundles and excrete honeydew. Armored scales have their entire body encased in the waxy cover, so excreting honeydew would result in a sticky mess. We now know that armored scales appear to feed on cell contents and intercellular sap, but not vascular bundles. Because of their large size, armored scale females produce many more eggs or crawlers than armored scales. While both scales have crawlers, soft scale nymphs and young females retain the use of their legs, and they can move whenever conditions are too harsh for their development. Once armored scale crawlers have settled, they begin to make the waxy test, lose their legs, and are no longer able to move. Rose scale females are irregularly oval and the exuvia being subcentral in location. The males are much smaller than the females and are elongate ovals with the exuvia being terminal. This pest is relatively common on rose and brambles such as blackberry and raspberry. It has been introduced into all countries where roses and brambles are cultivated. This species overwinters its eggs located under the female's test. The eggs hatch from late May into mid-June, and the crawlers settle on the canes where there is an open space. They often settle near each other so that there are clusters of females and males. There appears to be 2 generations with a second emergence of crawlers in early September. These finish development in time for the females to lay eggs that overwinter again. In southern states, there may be 3 generations in a season. Heavy populations cause sufficient damage to the bark of roses and brambles to cause their death. The Juniper scale is commonly found on junipers, cedars, cypress, and false cypress trees. Females are described as looking a little like a fried egg. They are spherical to oval with a central yellow exuvium. The males are tiny and thinly oval in outline with a median ridge called a keel on the white test. This species overwinters as mature mated females. In spring, these lay 35 to 45 eggs under the test. In mid-June, the crawlers emerge 10 to 14 days later and settle on the newer growth. Both males and females develop slowly and they reach maturity by late August. At that time, the males emerge, mate with the females, and die. The females then overwinter. While this scale is slow to develop, it can completely cover the needles and branches of its host, which first results in a grayish discoloration and eventual death of those branches. The pine needle scale is one of the most common armored scales found on landscape conifers. It can be found on all pines and spruces and occasionally on other conifers. There are actually two species found on conifers, the pine needle scale and the pine scale. An expert is needed to separate these two species. These species overwinter as eggs retained under the mother's test. The eggs are pink in color, and when the crawlers emerge in mid-May, about the time that common lilac is in full bloom, they are also pink. They quickly settle on needles, insert their mouth parts, and when they begin to feed, they turn a yellow-brown color. After a week to 10 days, the crawlers molt into the second instars, and these begin to form a white test. Male scales are smaller and a bit more slender than the female scales. The scales mature in 6 to 8 weeks, at which time the males emerge and mate with the females. The females lay eggs, and these hatch soon after being laid. There are 2 generations of these scales each season. Heavy infestations most commonly occur on mugo and Scotch pine that can result in needle yellowing and death. The Sweetgum scale is easily spotted because the female scales often cause the formation of a yellow-colored pit on leaves of sweetgum. These female scales are round to oval in shape and are usually covered with a white test. They form pits on the undersides of newly expanded leaves, but many of the scales also occur on smaller branches. Males are generally found on the branches or tucked into the corners of leaf veins. This native has a more complicated life cycle. Fertilized females overwinter on the bark of sweetgum trees. By mid-May, these have laid eggs and the crawlers generally settle on the newly expanded leaves. Here the females cause the gall-like pit to form in which they develop. Males usually settle near leaf veins and form an oblong test. This generation matures by mid-July, and new crawlers emerge over an extended time, often into September. These settle on branches. The summer generation matures by late September, then the non-winged males emerge to mate with the females. These mated females overwinter again. The Elongate Hemlock Scale is also commonly called the Hemlock Scale. While this scale is most important on hemlocks, it can be found on spruce, fir, and Douglas fir needles. The female test has a white fringe, and the reddish-brown to yellow body of the female can be seen through the test. The males have small, thin, white tests. This invasive from Japan seems to have a somewhat mixed life cycle. Mature females and females with eggs can overwinter. These females live a long time and produce eggs over several weeks in the spring. The yellow crawlers also emerge over an extended period. These generally settle on the undersides of needles and begin to feed. These nymphs take about 2 months to develop into new males and females. Early developing females may produce eggs for a second generation, and late developing females mate and overwinter to produce eggs the following spring. The Oystershell scale is very appropriately named as their test looks a lot like an oyster shell. This is one of the most common armored scales found in our landscapes, where it commonly attacks lilacs, maples, ash, poplar, dogwood, and willow. In most of its northern range, it undergoes one generation per season. It overwinters as white eggs located under the female test. In late May into early June, when common lilac is in full bloom, the crawlers begin to emerge. These usually settle on the bark of new shoots where they can be mistaken for bark lenticels. The males look like smaller versions of the female scales. The winged males emerge in July and mate with the newly molted females. Females continue to develop through August and then lay eggs to overwinter. The obscure scale is a common pest of red oak species, but it can occur on other oaks, beech, dogwood, hickory, and willow. It is a significant pest on recently transplanted oaks, where it can cause irregular growth, even death, of branches. The female scales reach 3 millimeters in rough diameter. The test is a mottled gray, with the exuvium being distinctly black and slightly off-center. New crawlers often settle under old tests, which results in a pile of scales in certain locations on the bark. Male tests are much smaller than the females. This scale overwinters the second instar nymphs that mature in mid-May. The males emerge and mate with the females. Females can lay up to 50 eggs over an extended period of time, and crawlers can be active from July through September. These reach the second instar and become dormant to overwinter. One generation occurs each season. The San Jose scale is a very common pest of apple orchards. This scale can also infest landscape crabapples as well as other flowering trees and hawthorn. When the scales settle on fruit, they cause a red discoloration around the test. On the bark of trees, they can also cause damage to the underlying cambium that can result in gouty surface growth. The scale tests are roughly circular to oval with a gray test and yellow central exuvium. The male tests are about half the size of the females. This pest appears to have originated from China, most likely arriving from imported fruit trees in the 1870s. This one overwinters as second instar nymphs covered with a black exuvium. These mature in May, and first generation crawlers are released in June. A second generation of crawlers emerge in late August into mid-September. The Euonymus scale is extremely common on vining and shrub-like Euonymus, but relatively rare on winged Euonymus. There's a smaller oyster-shell-shaped scale on winged Euonymus, the winged Euonymus scale. The Euonymus scale also commonly attacks Pachysandra, bittersweet, and privet. The Euonymus scale is sexually dimorphic, with females being roughly oyster-shell-shaped with a gray test and yellow exuvium. The males usually settle on leaves, and these form a white test that has 3 carnea, or ridges, and a yellow exuvia. Females are usually located on plant stems. This species overwinters as eggs located under the female test. The eggs hatch when Van Hoot spirea is in full bloom. The male crawlers tend to settle on new leaves, and the female crawlers prefer to settle on plant stems. Those that settle on leaves often produce yellow spots on the leaves. A second generation of crawlers emerge in late July into early August, and these mature and mate before winter temperatures arrive. This pest can cause severe dieback of infested plants. In this table, I wanted to emphasize that many of the armored scales have more than one generation per year, which means that they can build up large populations even though the females lay fewer eggs than the soft scales. Crawler emergence times can also vary considerably, and knowing when this vulnerable life stage is active can be the key to successful controls. Since the crawlers haven't formed a protective test and they have to feed, this stage has been the traditional target for insecticides. When the crawlers are active, soft contact insecticides like insecticidal soaps and horticultural oils can be very effective. But thorough application is needed in order to ensure contact with the active and settled crawlers.